Hi everyone, good evening. Far from the ideal slot, but still hope to engage most of you given the relevance and criticality of the topic at hand. Really not going to spend any time at all talking about the why of sort of quality ECE, arguably one of the most impactful investments that any country can make. Instead, we have a slightly different sort of a format today where we want to sort of spend a few minutes sharing our overview of the current landscape, opportunities and challenges in public service delivery of early childhood education in India, which my colleague Aditi will lead, following which our two panelists, Amrita, who's here in person, and Dr. Vinita Kaul, who's joining us online, will sort of share their critique and commentary of that presentation along with their own reflections and experiences from their really vast experience in early childhood education. Yeah. So without further ado, I'll quickly invite Aditi over for our presentation.
Thank you, Krishnan. This is our hypothesis for ECE in India. Despite progressive policies, ECE outcomes in India continue to be low, and this could probably be on account of confused provisioning and poor government service delivery through both Anganwadis and pre-primary sections in government schools. Over the next 5 minutes, let's unpack this a little bit through the lens of policy, access, enrollment, and outcomes to arrive at opportunities and challenges for early childhood education through the public system in India. So firstly, when we look at ECE policies, they're really best in class. Both the National ECE policy of 2013 and more recently the National Education Policy that came out in 2020 say all the right things with respect to ECE, that it should be play-based, developmentally appropriate, not one-size-fits-all. In fact, the NEP also calls for universalizing quality ECE for all children ages 3 to 6 by the year 2030. However, unfortunately, strong policies have not translated to good outcomes. In fact, nationally, if we think that our FLN outcomes are poor, then our ECE outcomes are even worse, and they indicate abysmal levels of school readiness for our youngest learners. In fact, we don't even have a national large-scale assessment by the government, like a NAS, to measure school readiness outcomes for 5-year-olds. In the absence of this, we rely on large-scale private surveys. For instance, if you look at the graph on the right, which is from the IECI report that was released in 2017, only 1 in 6 5-year-olds were able to do the simple pictorial pattern that's up on the slide. ASR 2019 early years also paints a very, very similar alarming picture of learning outcomes for age 5. So what explains these poor learning outcomes? For us, the answer lies in confused provisioning and enrollment. As you're all aware, public provisioning of ECE in India is through two systems, the Anganwadi and pre-primary sections in government schools. And when we look at the data carefully, the biggest cause of concern in provisioning and enrollment in ECE is of the 5-year-old cohort. So if you see the graph on the left, I know it's very small, but this is the ASR 2022 survey. If you see the graph on the left and focus on the orange bar, that's really the percentage share of 5-year-olds that are in Anganwadi. And when you compare them with the blue and yellow bars, it's alarmingly low, which means that 5-year-olds are not really in Anganwadis. And when we corroborate this with data from DICE, we see that 50% of the grade 1 cohort nationally is already in grade 1, which means they're already receiving developmentally inappropriate instruction. All the states in red, there are about 15 of them, are states where more than half the class 1 cohort is below 6 years of age. So fundamentally, when we think of ECE, we feel that the effective learning time that's available in ECE classrooms is scarce. And this is a function of two things. One is the total learning time available in ECE classrooms, and the second is the quality of learning time available in classrooms. And the left side, which is the total learning time available in classrooms, is largely governed by systemic constraints. And the right side is programmatic factors which used to exist for, say, FLN pre-Nipun Bharat. So let's unpack these constraints a little bit more. There are three systemic barriers for ECE in India. Firstly, prioritization or focus on ECE is low. When you look at the Anganwadi system, ECE is only one among 21 responsibilities of the Anganwadi worker, who we've called the Anganwadi teacher here. Unfortunately, across both departments, there are no tangible monitoring indicators which measure the quality of ECE instruction that are happening in the classroom. When we look at the monitoring indicators for the Ministry of Women and Child Development, we see that what they monitor is limited to student attendance and delivery of TLMs in the classroom. And lastly, there's weak convergence, like one of the earlier speakers mentioned, weak convergence and coordination between both the departments on ECE. The second and related constraint is that there are inadequate budgets for ECE. The number that Ashish had mentioned earlier, which was about 677 crores allocated by the Department of Education, if we combine that with the allocation by the Ministry of Women and Child Development, we see that about 3,000 crores are allocated for 3 cohorts of children by both the departments together. Now, if we think of the number in terms of allocation per pupil in ECE, we realize that public provision of ECE spends less than 1,000 rupees per child on early childhood education. And this is just 8% of the per pupil expenditure that we spend as a country on primary or elementary grades. Lastly, there's a problem of low teacher availability. Of course, the Anganwadi system does not have a dedicated ECE teacher. They have a worker and a helper who are expected to do 20 other things along with early childhood education. And even in states which have made progress on provisioning of pre-primary sections in government schools, we see that there is a lack of a dedicated teacher. For instance, if you see the Assam data, which is right in the center at the bottom, you'll notice that Assam has made a headway in terms of provisioning of the preparatory class or the Balvatika, which is known as Kar Shreni in Assam. Almost 65% of government schools in Assam have a pre-primary section or a Kar Shreni, but only 0.2% of these classrooms have a dedicated teacher. 11% of Kar Shreni classrooms in Assam have a teacher that's been allotted to the Kar Shreni classroom who also happens to teach class 1 or 2. Alongside these systemic challenges, there are also programmatic barriers to quality of ECE in India. Firstly, the curriculum that's made is not designed keeping in mind that age group and the reality of our ECE provisioning. It lacks key features such as how to manage pedagogy and how to manage play-based learning with multi-age group classrooms. Even when the curriculum is designed in many states, anecdotally, we've learned that materials often don't reach the preschools or the Anganwadis. And even when they're present, they're often incoherent. So for example, the workbook does not really speak to the teacher handbook or the kit. The second programmatic issue is that there is low quality of teacher training and support in ECE across India. So Anganwadi systems don't have the equivalent of SCRTs or diets to design and deliver trainings for teachers. And even when trainings happen, they're often rote-based, they're often lecture-based or they have limited transferability to the classroom. And lastly, underpinning all of this is ill-informed parental demand for ECE. Parents often perceive that ECE should focus on rote memorization or that children in ECE classrooms should get homework. And this is completely different from what experts have to say about play-based learning or play-based pedagogy for that age group. So quickly summarizing, there are about 6 challenges that we've put out for ECE in India. But we also feel that in the last 1 year, there has been considerable momentum from states to improve the quality of ECE. And these are the opportunities that states should focus on over the next couple of years. Firstly, to streamline entry age between Anganwadis, Balvatikas, and grade 1. There has been momentum on this. The MOE recently also released a letter to say that class 1 entry age should be streamlined to 6 years, and subsequently other entry age across Anganwadis and Balvatikas should be fixed accordingly. Secondly, states should designate a Balvatika, either by starting a new pre-primary section in their schools or by designating co-located Anganwadis as Balvatikas, as many states have started to do. Third is to hire dedicated teachers or volunteers and leverage MOE funds to do this, or leverage state and districts funds to do this. Fourth is a one-time upgrade of curriculum and training materials to align with both NCF and the state FLN mission or the grade 1 curriculum. And lastly, states need to rationalize the role of the Anganwadi teacher to make more time for ECE in Anganwadis. So oftentimes the Anganwadi worker is duplicating the roles done by the helper or the ASHA and the ANM, and this needs to be rationalized. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditi. Obviously, there was a lot of information and data packed into that, and what we wanted to do is to have a couple of very, very senior experts weigh in on this issue, react to this presentation, and add color to it based on their own lived experiences. First of those, we have Amrita with us. Amrita is an education specialist at UNICEF India based in the Rajasthan office. She has worked for over 20 years in the education sector in multicultural setups in India and South Asia. She has provided advisory and technical support to different states of India and South Asia on improving learning outcomes for children with equity, covering ECE, foundational literacy and numeracy, as well as the second decade of education for adolescents with a focus on the large-scale remedial program. Over to you, Amrita. Thank you so much for being with us. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, and yeah, it's good evening. And I really thank CSF for giving me this opportunity. Thanks Aditi for a comprehensive presentation on ECE. And I actually thank you, Lokesh ji. You started your conversation on FLN, that if the FLN ecosystem, which is, I think, almost everybody in this room today, if the entire FLN program don't look into the ECC 3 to 6, then there is a possibility that what we are all aspiring for, that every child at grade 3 would be able to have learning outcome, might be a little difficult. So I think in terms of the presentation, with all the challenges we are grappling at the state level and everywhere, I have few kind of observation and experience sharing based on our experience as UNICEF. I think one important thing is that though national education policy has given emphasis on ECCE, is also 3 to 6 overall. And if you see in India, from post-2013, a lot of work has happened on ECCE and post-national ECCE policy. So whenever every states now have been working on it, there has been a kind of like a convergence between ICDS and School Education Department, because there are a lot of work in terms of curriculum, materials, training has happened post-2013. I know as UNICEF, like 15 states at least has worked on the curriculum, workbook, and all sorts of materials. So whenever in School Education Department, the work on ECE, either on the co-located or in a standalone, the convergence with the ICDS and the entire work ICDS has been doing since 2014-15, it's really worth looking into. Aditi, you have rightly pointed out the capacity, like a lack of teacher institute on ECC. That's a big gap, I would say. There is, earlier Professor Kaul is here. Professor Kaul, I'm sure, would be talking about the role of MLTC, WTC, but then they don't exist anymore in most of the states. And one of the thing is that if even SCRT and DIET take the responsibility of ECCE, but then how much SCRT and DIET is equipped with play-based pedagogy, which is the central of ECCE. So with these, apart from the lack of teacher education institute on ECCE, but even existing institution, if they want to take a lead on this, whether the capacity on play-based pedagogy and what we can do to strengthen the capacity, that is one area we really need to look into. One of the thing, I've been kind of thinking from the morning, and I was also, when Sonali was talking about the socio-emotional learning, and in terms of how we bring the socio-emotional learning and executive function in ECE. Apart from, 1 year preschool Balvatika, how the socio-emotional learning or play-based pedagogy or executive function can brought into, because we have seen that the way we do the play-based pedagogy for the smaller kids like a 3 and 4, whenever these come to the school, the whole thing become the more activity-based learning rather than stay as a play-based. So how we can have a balance in that. One of the interesting thing, I was looking at some data, and one of the interesting thing I was seeing, though there has been a lot of focus on NEP, and the presentation talked about the low emphasis on, less budget or less allocation on ECE. Though there has been a lot of focus on ECE, on NEP, but there has been a budget reduction. If you see the Shaksham Anganwadi guideline, the MWCD has majorly slashed ECC budget. And in the states where there are co-located Anganwadi, where they used to receive money from PAB for the Anganwadi center, from this year they are not receiving it. Because the PAB guideline says that ECE money would only come for ECC in the government school, not for the co-located. Co-located would only get for the building as learning aid once in 5 years. So there has been a huge reduction of budget or allocation for ECC. So if we really want to strengthen the results for FLN, so the entire FLN ecosystem also needs to see how the ECC program and the focus on ECC and ECC budget would be there. Today I was amazed to see the entire monitoring system has been being used on FLN in different states, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, UP. ECC doesn't have any data. No, zero data. No monitoring system. So, the disparity of also the work happening, I think one also need to look into how the data system and the monitoring can be. Even like I come from Rajasthan, okay, fair enough. I come from Rajasthan, which has a very successful co-located model, but no data, no monitoring. So how this ECC program can also learn from the entire very strong FLN, many of them are technology-based monitoring happening, I think that is one area one need to look into. Finally, I have 2 points. One is, I'm sure that, one is that co-located Anganwadi has been a successful model, and he has really improved the functioning of Anganwadi system. But beyond that, how much the co-located has worked, and if it's not worked, why it's not worked, I think some kind of evidence, strong evidence generation is important. And since this is a CSF conclave, CSF I know heavily into research on ECC, certain evidence generation can be part of this. I'm sure since 1 year Balvatika is coming as an important precursor of FLN, the study you have been doing also focusing on the costing model of 1 year Balvatika. If every state needs to start 1 year Balvatika or preschool with the primary school, they read, and with a dedicated earmark teacher, it requires a huge budget. And my final suggestion would be, whatever we do, 1 year preschool, 3 to 6, strengthening the preschool, ECC with FLN, mother tongue-based education should be, we really need to look into the language of children. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amrita. I think something that Shavita called out in her opening remarks, that we also have a lot of people in this room who actually keep us honest, and I think Amrita has done some of that, and also pushed us forward in the right direction on many fronts. Next up, we have Dr. Vinita Kaul, who's joining us online. Professor Kaul, we can see you. Hope you can hear us.
Yes, I can.
Great.
Am I audible?
Sorry,
Am I
go ahead.
audible? Am
Yes,
I audible?
yes,
Yeah.
you're audible. Great. Dr. Vinita Kaul is Professor Emerita Education in Ambedkar University, Delhi, from where she retired in 2016 as Director of School of Education Studies and Founder Director of the Center for Early Childhood Education and Development, CSED. She's the Chief Editor of a biannual journal, Children First, focused on children's lives. Professor Kaul led the India Early Childhood Education Impact, or the IECEI study, which was really the first of its kind in India, which followed a cohort of 14,000 4-year-olds for 5 years from 2011 to 16 to estimate the immediate impact of ECE on school readiness levels and its sustained impact on educational and behavioral outcomes during primary grades. Prior to this, Professor Kaul worked at the World Bank and NCRT for over 20 years. For me, it feels very artificial to be doing this introduction for Professor Kaul. I think the simple line for me is that pretty much everything that I personally know about ECE, she's been kind enough to share with me over the years. And there are so many in the community, in the ECE community, who sort of look up to her for guidance, and really no better person to sort of have the last word on ECE, so to speak. So over to you, Professor Kaul. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Krishnan. Thank you very much for those very kind words. And I certainly don't have the last word on ECE, so I'm sure there will be many more, and there should be. But yeah, very quickly, since the time is short, it was really very impressive, the presentation that Aditi made, which is very comprehensive, and I think it covers just about all the issues challenges that are there with early childhood education. I would like to just begin by saying that I think this is a sentence perhaps from the national policy, which I just want to quote. Maybe if I'm wrong, if it is because there were several versions of the national policy ultimately, whether it was retained, but which said that spending on ECE should be seen as an investment and not as an expenditure. And I think the crux of everything is the budgetary provision, which I think the presentation has highlighted, as well as Amrita has so effectively articulated. And why I'm saying that is because somewhere it's an attitudinal issue that, the education, no matter what the national policy may say, whatever the national curriculum framework may say, but if you go around and listen to talk to people, there is this clear attitudinal issue that early childhood is still not significant. So if we have to invest, we must invest in primary education. We must get the teachers per grade, which is also important. I'm not undermining the importance of that. But despite all the advocacy that, the earliest years are the most critical, and whatever we expect to get in terms of outcomes from primary starts getting determined in the early years, in the early childhood years. Despite all that advocacy, still the attitude towards early childhood education remains one of rather patronizing, I would say, but not supportive. And therefore, the budgetary issue is a major issue. There are two things with the budget. One, of course, is that, as the presentation has shown, and Amrita has very effectively, as I said, talked about the real situation in the field. There is this whole, one is, of course, that everything rests on the budget, because you don't have a teacher, you don't have materials, you don't have the infrastructure. All that is very critical to the quality of early childhood education and play-based pedagogy. But more than that, it is also a kind of a statement that we make about the government's own, and I'm sorry to say, I'm continuing in a critical tone, the government's own perception of the importance of early childhood care and education. Along with budget, what also comes through from both Amrita and Aditi's presentation and Amrita's remarks is also the whole issue of convergence, which is a very large issue. We find that no matter what happens, no matter what the priorities, and still the convergence remains a major challenge between the women and child and the education. And the provision for the earliest years, which are the most critical years, lie with early childhood, with the Women and Child Development Department in those early childhood years when the brain development is at its maximum pace. And if that importance, that advocacy is not supported with budgetary provisions, with importance in terms of systemic support, like Amrita said, that there's no monitoring system, there's no data available even now on early childhood. So where are we investing? Where are we really investing? Are we really investing in the child, or are we investing in a school system? And that also not completely adequately. So I think these are larger issues that are very much there. I think what I pick up also is a third major issue. I'm not going into the details of the issues that are the challenges, which of course have already been, as I said, presented very well in the presentation and supported by what Amrita has said. So I will not repeat any of that. But I think that a third issue, which is very much there, is the attitudinal one. Just this morning, I was in a meeting where somebody was telling me that toys are a waste of time. Because what we have seen is that toys children sort of outgrow and they become irrelevant, and it's much better to sort of teach them how to think, etc. I think there is enough research. The ICI study that we have that Krishnan has mentioned has very emphatically and very credibly it has proven that the play-based pedagogy is much more effective, not only in the early childhood period, that is from 3 to 6 years, but if it is continued into the primary years, into the classes 1 and 2, then play-based pedagogy can really help to sustain the gains of early childhood. Otherwise, there tends to be a declining trend. So somewhere it is, especially in the formal education system, there continues to be, despite whatever is written in any of the policy documents, a resistance to any kind of play-based pedagogy. What Amrita just talked about, the difference between activity-based pedagogy and play-based pedagogy. And I think the primary difference rests in the role of the teacher. In a play-based pedagogy, the action is with the children. They are child-initiated activities where the child's involvement is total. Whereas in a activity-based, so-called, the way we practice it, I mean, there are no clear demarcations in the two. There is this whole emphasis on the teacher doing activities to demonstrate and teach. So somewhere the locus of control of the teaching is or learning is with the teacher, whereas in the child-initiated pedagogy, there is much more in action, and the control is with the children, but the planned environment is very important. The other important thing, I think, is that what do we mean by play-based pedagogy? Because as I was talking about the toys being mentioned as a waste of time, play-based is not just letting children play. Play-based is planned approach. It's a pedagogical approach which is based on scientific principles through which children are actually hand-holded through the years from 3 to 8 years. And we have seen that where it has been done, and of course in very smaller numbers, we've been able to really study that because it's not a prevailing practice, but children have done remarkably well and had a very sustained foundation. So somewhere I think that we have to work alongside whatever else is being done, the provisions that have to be made. We need to be working on these attitudinal aspects of getting people, parents, education department people, others who are the stakeholders, to really understand what play-based pedagogy is and not go with the belief that play is a waste of time, but it is a much more effective method than teacher-centered. I would just like to support this by recently there was a study by Leslie Cohen, I think her name was, which she looked at the pedagogy, the school systems in 5 countries that had topped in PISA. And what she found common across those 5 countries was in the school system was that the formal teaching has been delayed in each of those countries, and they have a very, very rich, very stimulating preschool programs, play-based pedagogy, child-initiated pedagogy, which is what is really giving them the foundation that is needed. So I think that these are the main things that I would like to say, to add on to whatever, because I don't want to repeat. And I think that somewhere it is important to also consider that if we apply this play-based pedagogy, one of the challenges is the teacher, because we don't have a teacher, dedicated teacher. Where we have a teacher, we may not necessarily have a trained teacher. And these are some of the major hurdles that come in the way of getting children to really take benefit of a participation in preschool programs. We have seen in our ICI study that that particular sample across 3 states, there were almost 80% of the children were in a preschool and they were participating. And yet, when we saw their school readiness levels at age 5, they were very low, as was shown in the presentation. So main reason for that was because they were not getting appropriate pedagogy. Most of them were being subjected to formal teaching and the 3 hours. So somewhere it is very important to one of the possibilities I would suggest, which is I think an interim suggestion, not a substitute for a teacher, is to at least, if the teacher, Anganwadi worker is very occupied, then there is the play-based pedagogy itself allows for a lot of children's participation in very stimulating activities without the control with the teacher. As I said, the teacher can just be there to facilitate, and children can be engaged very meaningfully if there are enough materials in the classroom. So I think one of the ways to supplement or to fill the gap of an active teacher is to provide some learning materials, where again the budget becomes an issue. And last, I'm sorry for being very repetitive. Somebody mentioned in the previous session that despite all that is happening, children are not coming to school. This was in the literacy LLF session. And that children are, attendance is very low across many schools. And so there may be multiple reasons. I'm not saying the only reason, but I do know from experience and with research that if we have a play-based pedagogy, and I would not like to spell it out because that can be done later, attendance can be very, very positively impacted, because we've seen that children not only don't want to go from school, they want to come back very fast. So somewhere I think I would just like to end here. And thank you very much, Krishnan and Aditi, for giving me this opportunity.